Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And today we have the great honor and pleasure of having a dialogue with the great Stanley Fish, who is a very noted theorist in the humanities, very known for literary theory, literary scholarship, famous for a book called Is There a Text in This Class? I love that title. Very associated with Duke University for many years. Now he's based in Cardozo Law, which is where we're filming, in Manhattan. And tomorrow, Stanley gives an important talk on the humanities, the crisis in the humanities. And this is a topic we've addressed on our show since we premiered in 2010. I'm not really an interviewer per se. I consider myself a teacher with a talk show. So we're having a collegial dialogue with my new friend Stanley Fish, a great man of literature, a great man of the humanities, and we're going to see what we can learn from this hour-long dialogue. And his latest book is called Winning Arguments. So I'm going to try not to have an argument with Stanley because I'll probably lose. Because he wrote the book. I just read the book. But let's begin with tomorrow's lecture, Stanley. What are you going to talk about? What's on your mind today? We are in April 2018. Donald J. Trump is president of the United States. Let's just contextualize this. It's been said that there's a dumbing down in our country and an anti-intellectualization going on, and we're trying to hold the fort here. And what is your talk going to be tomorrow?
I'm going to emphasize, or at least focus on, the traditional justifications of the humanities that humanists bring forward when a challenge is made to humanistic study, especially to humanistic study in universities where, in the context of public schools, citizens are being asked to foot the bill for the study of subjects about which they know little and in which they have absolutely no interest. So the question is, why should the state, or in the case of private universities, why should the donors to the endowments of private universities give money so that these programs of research and teaching should continue, since it's very difficult to understand how a study, for example, of Byzantine art or animal imagery in the prefaces to Restoration drama could have any relationship to the bottom line of a state's economy or to the betterment of society's political community. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. There are 4 or 5 standard justifications, and I'm going to be discussing them and making the point that none of them works. By that I mean none of them will sell, because that's the issue. How do you justify to people whose values and traditions are not yours what you do? And the answer to that question is an impossible task. It can't be done.
Let's go back to Matthew Arnold, who talked about all the best that's been written and the sweetness and light that we get from the humanities. Don't you think that the humanities in some way makes people happier by reading literature?
That's one of the arguments. You've read my talk?
No, okay.
That's one of the standard arguments, that people who spend their lives studying literary or complicated philosophical texts will thereby exercise their intelligences and to also widen the range of empathy, and so become persons capable of living a fuller, more discriminating and nuanced life. And therefore, in that sense, be happier persons. Not happier in a crude, sensual, hedonistic way, but just happier as being truly fulfilled and enlightened human beings. Now, that sounds very good, but unfortunately it doesn't work. Because it seems to me that, at least for those who study and teach the humanities in colleges and universities. The focus is on a set of traditional materials and a set of questions that come along with those materials, questions inherited from a long tradition that began many centuries ago of humanistic study. And if you succeed in this line of work, in the end, what you will be able to do is discourse with some competence on a number of topics that those who have not had this training would know little about. But what won't happen to you is that you will become a better person. And that's what I call the fantasy of thinking, I've read more books, so I must be a better person. This is just silly. Absolutely silly. I can imagine somebody, and I'm sure you can too, people whose educational levels are perhaps minimal, but nevertheless who have a very strong interest in civic and political matters, and like to think about them and speak about them in ways that command attention. So having an advanced degree is neither a prerequisite for engaging in such conversations, nor a guarantee that if you do have the advanced degree, you will be able to engage in such conversations. That's a familiar fallacy that academics themselves buy into, that academic degrees in history or anthropology or chemistry or whatever it might be, not only equip you in the usual disciplinary ways, but equip you with a general wisdom that you can then dispense to a waiting world. About a year and a half ago, a bunch of historians, a lot of them, 550 or so, many of them eminent, signed a letter, the historian's letter against Trump, in which they advised the citizens of the United States to vote against Trump for reasons that they proceeded to list, reasons that had to do, they claimed, with their expert historical knowledge. And I wrote a piece against them in the New York Times, pointing out that while I would be more than happy to listen to an historian who is telling me about the facts and traditions and history of his or her subject, and I might even want to factor in what I learned from that historian into my decision when I went into the ballot box, that doesn't mean that I should take ballot box advice from that historian, because that historian is an expert in history, not in political wisdom. So that I found this entire enterprise of the historians the usual extraordinarily hubristic assumption, again, that the possession of an advanced degree made you into a person of advanced wisdom. And this, as I said a moment ago, is just absolutely silly.
Now, we know that Barack Obama was a great reader, and also a great writer and thinker and intellectual in that way, and it's been said that Donald Trump doesn't read. He has very little patience for books, for reading. Now, okay, we've heard this. Now, what about having a cabinet-level minister of literature, or somebody who's going to be with the president, whoever the president is? I think it's important that they can also be well read. It's important, don't you think, that that has something to do with their own sense of empathy and their own soul?
Well, again, I must reject that argument in general. That is, I think that empathy and largeness of soul, broadness of perspective, however you put it, does not necessarily come from having taken the right courses in Shakespeare, Plato, Goethe, Dostoevsky, and the rest. It seems to me, and this is the argument that I'll be making tomorrow, and it's one that I've made before, that both the pleasures and the values of that activity, humanistic activity, are internal to it. Or as I say at one point in my talk tomorrow, I hate to be the one to tell you, but spending a life engaged with literary and philosophical text has very little predictable, beneficial byproduct at all.
You think that's going to go over well, or?
I don't know. I hope not.
So you have a reputation as being a contrarian. Is that part of your personality? Or?
Well, I didn't wake up one morning, X number of decades ago and say, I think I'll be a contrarian. But it's a label that's been applied to me over the years, and one that I finally, I guess, adopted, because in the book that I published in 2015, called Think Again. The subtitle reads Contrarian Reflections on, then there's a list of things that I contrarily reflect on.
Okay. So you've embraced the label.
Yeah, but it's more, what I'm interested in is the way in which public arguments first emerge into the scene, become popular, or at least relatively powerful and persuasive, then in many cases become challenged and either accept the challenge and indeed are victorious in the challenge, or are defeated and become the ideas that we now historicize. This used to be a set of arguments that people were persuaded by. We no longer are. So I'm just interested in how that happens. And also I'm interested in the way in which standard stories about a certain topic that's considered important arise, and what those stories are. Let me give you an example. We're now all concerned with the rise of so-called fake news, right? And there's lots of explanations for it. And some people say that fake news is the product of postmodernist relativism and nihilism, and other attribute fake news to politically malevolent persons, and there are other explanations. My explanation, which I'm going to be giving in a piece that the Times will publish in the next couple of weeks, is that fake news is the direct result of transparency, of the rage for transparency, one of those words these days that is uttered with almost a theological reverence. It's hard to say that you're against transparency.
Right.
I'm happy to say that I'm against transparency, because what the people who are the promoters of transparency, people that I call, and this is of course not my phrase, techno-utopians, what they believe is that the trouble with the communicative processes in which we are all involved is that information is filtered through a connected series of gatekeepers, which include so-called experts, university departments, standard encyclopedias, news commentators on major networks, credentialed authorities, and the rest. So the idea is that these are all authorities that are suspect. They just happen to emerge historically and claim an eternal authority that is really not theirs. Or an even darker version, all these authorities are in place just to maintain the status quo and to keep back the introduction of any genuinely new ideas. So let's get rid of filters, gatekeepers, authorities that intervene between us and the data. And this is what I call the romance of the data and us. The romance of the data and us. And when that happens, when there's no framing or filtering of the data, then the truth will emerge, and we will have an encounter with the truth that is not biased by a set of questionable authorities. To which I reply, if in fact that ever were to happen, what you would not have is a purified pool of information. You would have information untethered to anything. You would have little bits of data.
Sounds like Facebook.
Yeah, well, perhaps. Little bits of data that are just lying there, unattached to any perspective that you might either question or honor. And therefore, because they are just lying there, they can be assembled and reassembled into any form that someone who has a desire might in fact prefer. Now, also, because the whole process of becoming transparent has done away with filters and gatekeepers and the judgments of authority, once in this brave new world, these little flotsams and jetsam pieces of data have been assembled into a story, there's no resource for assessing or judging the story, because assessing and judging are precisely the mechanisms of suspicion that have been done away with. And instead what you have are stories that can be assembled by anyone without any authority, without any device for assessing them against other potential stories, and therefore any story that is told about anything is as good as any other. And what's that called? Fake news. So, for example, one of the cabinet members in Trump's cabinet, I forget which one it was, has recently said that the extensive evidence provided by climate science about the coal industry and about the deleterious effects of coal on the environment are only telling part of the story. And therefore there's going to be a period in which other voices other than these credentialed experts, who are of course held in great suspicion, can come forward. And then, the cabinet member said, the public can make up its mind. Now, what in the world could that possibly mean? The public could make up its mind as choosing between, let's say, the head of the climate department at Princeton University and some teenager in a basement in Idaho with a computer who has a contrary view. That's what has brought us to this sorry state. And that's my analysis of fake news. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for that. Looking at the media today, Stanley, now, when I first decided to have a TV show, really coming out of academia, coming out as a humanistic intellectual, I see myself more in that tradition of the humanities, of literature. I looked at the media, I said, there is kind of a space for this, because you see like Charlie Rose and Bill Moyers, there is a space for erudite discourse on the media. When I look at the media now, I don't find that space. I find it narrowing. And I'm wondering, what's your take on that? Where are the spaces that we can have these enriching? Obviously, we're having it now. This is going on a cable show. We would like this to go out to more and more people, but we look at the landscape today, even Leonard Lopate, who had a wonderful radio show in New York, who was one of my fans, he's now off the air. What's going on? He's off the air too, yeah. So what's going on with the sort of erosion of intellectual spaces?
The easiest answer, and it's in part a true answer, is the pressure of the marketplace. And so that people, that used to be the case, as I'm sure you recall, that CBS News quite was subsidized by the rest of CBS, and it was a design plan by those who ran CBS. We know that the news that our news programs are not going to bring in the revenue that other programs like quiz shows bring.
As a loss leader.
Bring in, and we also know that in fact there might even be losses involved, since sometimes the production of programs like 60 Minutes or Frontline could be very expensive. But nevertheless, we're going to maintain this because that's part of our public service responsibility. And I guess that's faded. I mean, I don't know any network heads, so I can't speak from experience. But it doesn't seem that kind of thing, except on PBS and also once a week at least on HBO, where they run these very good documentaries, usually in where I live on Monday evenings. But it's not thought any longer to be part of the general task of network news, or of the most commonly seen broadcasting venues, to bring to the public the kind of conversation that you and I are having right now.
And is that okay?
Well, no, it's not okay. But it's, again, I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite,
Yes.
Who was called by many the most trusted man in America.
Right.
And do you remember what his sign-off was every night?
Oh, let me remember. That's the news, or that's the
way it is. That's
okay.
the way. That's a very nice phrase. That's the way it is. In other words, you've just heard the way things are, whatever the topic was. You've just heard the way things are. And a lot of people out there in the country would say, yeah, right. Because there was a general sense of trust in what these journalists, especially journalists in the position of being anchor persons were doing. Now, I don't think that trust exists any longer, and you can see why. There have been exposés of anchor persons and of personalities like Charlie Rose, Brian Williams a few years ago, Matt Lauer recently, a number of other people less celebrated. So each time this happens, the fake news narrative in which most of the fake news is being presented by ABC, NBC, and CBS, that narrative becomes more and more persuasive to a large number of people. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that everything that Walter Cronkite ever said was either accurate or was wholly without some political motivation. No human being has ever existed, with the exception of Jesus Christ, who could claim that quality. But nevertheless, we don't need perfect persons to be repositories of trust. We need a general trust in our institutions, and that general trust in our institutions has been eroded again by the distrust of authority that, as I've already said several times, goes along with the rage for transparency and more information. The idea that the more information we have, the clearer the truth will emerge. The only trouble with that thing wrong with that idea is that it is false.
Okay. Now, one of the arguments made by the intellectual left, which I got pulled into a little bit around the circle of Stanley Aronowitz and his friends, and Stanley was a friend of Marcuse, and when they talk about the way things might be. So what's the difference between the way things are? They say we shouldn't get buried in just the is. We should think about a better world that might be more loving, more caring, more peaceful. What do you say to that argument?
Well, no one would say nay to that hope. The question is, whose job is it to produce that? Now, I don't know what Stanley would think about this, but he might believe, as some people on the left do believe, that it's the university's job to produce that. Colleges and universities, higher education, should be pointing us in the direction of a better community, of improved values, of less corrupt avenues of communication, and so forth. My response to that is to say that universities are not in that line of work. That's not their business. Universities are presiding over a very old enterprise, at least as old as the enterprise which saw Plato teaching Socrates and Socrates teaching everyone else. And that's the enterprise in which you look at ideas, you turn them over, and then you turn them over again. And then you ask someone to come up and turn them over a third time. And you do this not in order to move toward some political action in the world, but you do it because it is an activity that you value for its own sake. And this, I think, is what should be going on in universities. The British political theorist Michael Oakeshott once described what happens in a 4-year college experience as an interval. And by that, he explained he meant an interval between those moments, both before you come to college and after you leave college, those moments in which the pressure to make a decision to go in this direction rather than in that direction is unrelenting and never relaxed. But he said in these 4 years, that pressure is relaxed. And what you have is the leisure, and this is Aristotle speaking, the leisure for contemplation. And that, I think, is what goes on in the university. Now, whether or not the people who go through this experience will emerge better citizens and more ready to take up the task that we mentioned a few moments ago, that is the task of making the world better, is, I think, a debatable question. But that can't be the goal of college and university life. That can't be what administrators set out to do. What administrators set out to do is put together departments of English, chemistry, anthropology, philosophy, mathematics, etc., in which the best minds working on the key issues and the disciplines are brought together in a conversation which is then extended to the students of that university. Now, what happens after that, that is, after the students leave a course at the end of a semester, is entirely, I would say, contingent. That in some cases, some people are inspired by their education experience to go out and do things which include bettering the conditions of our society, and others are not. They kind of put it all back in the bottom drawer and go about their lives. But I don't think that the university can directly engage or have its faculty directly engage in that project of improving society. And that was the point of a book that I wrote in 2008, and the title tells its story, Save the World on Your Own Time.
Well, I guess that would contradict somewhat what I received in my master's program at NYU, which was a program that was actually founded in 1947 by Louise Rosenblatt.
Oh, yes, a very good person.
Yeah, who came out of John Dewey's thinking, where education and democracy come together. So at NYU, where I had professors like Gordon Pradle and John Mayer, we always arranged the desks in a circle, and I can see you rolled your eyes.
Yeah, right.
And it was, you know.
In my classrooms, the desks and the chairs are nailed to the ground. And as far as I'm concerned, if I could manage it without going to jail, I'd nail the students to the ground, too.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, boy. Boy, this man means business, I'll tell you. You know, I want to just, Claudia, can you just pan around the room? I always like to situate our interview in time and space. We're in an academic office here on Fifth Avenue in New York City. This is the hallowed halls of academe. I'm only on the fringe of this, by the way. I'm an adjunct professor, so we are very low paid, and we are lucky to be teaching a class here and there. But actually, have you anything to say about that, about the plight of adjunct professors that are so underpaid?
Yes, they are. I think that economic circumstances and the pressures on senior administrators to make budgets work have resulted in this horrible situation, many times documented, in which a person with an advanced degree from a good program, especially in this city of New York, may spend her day running around to 4 colleges to give adjunct courses for a total yearly pay of about $17,000. You know, and that, which of course is not a living wage. And because there are so many PhDs who weren't able to gain full-time employment, there are so many, for every humanities job, for example, offered, there are hundreds of applicants. This is a ready labor pool that administrators cannot help take advantage of. They just, there they are. They're there for the, they're there asking to be exploited. So we'll exploit them.
Oh, boy.
And what's the solution? Well, some people, friends of mine who were involved in this, in dealing with the situation, believe that unionization is a necessity, so that these people who have no representation, who have no tenure even with a small t, who can and are unemployed at will at any moment, that these people could gain some rights, which were enumerated and written down, and also could gain some bargaining rights. Now, I don't know whether this is going to succeed. It has succeeded in some places, always meeting resistance both from administrators and to some extent from tenured faculty who don't like to think of themselves as union people. I don't know what's going to happen, but as you and I both know, the strength of unions in this country has decreased enormously in the last 40 to 50 years. So I'm not sure whether, and public employer unions have been on the decline for many years, and in high-profile ways in states like Wisconsin and others. So it's a very, I think it's a very unhappy situation, and I certainly don't have a solution for it, although there are others who have thought about this more than I have who may.
Okay. I want to turn to the book, which is the direct reason for actually us being here today, Stanley, which is your book, Winning Arguments: What Works and Doesn't Work in Politics, the Bedroom, the Courtroom, and the Classroom, by Stanley Fish. And I stumbled upon this book at the Strand bookstore, one of the great bookstores in the country in New York, and it just spoke to me, and I said, I got to get this book. This was a few months ago, and I read it from cover to cover, because we're trying to make the argument that our show, which is a nonprofit TV show, needs to be supported more and needs to grow. So I said, now arguments, I've always shied away from arguments. I've always been one that I associate arguments with anger and bad feelings. So I always kind of gravitate more towards dialogue, and especially to people like Jürgen Habermas, who says, let's have a nice constructive dialogue and everything is nice. Even Martin Buber, with the sacredness of the I and thou. So this book, in a way, sort of got me out of that a little bit, sort of toughened me up, and you got to get out there and you got to state your point and defend it. Why did you write this book, Winning Arguments?
Oh, I wrote this book because my publisher gave me a huge advance.
Okay, well, that's
which I hope the publisher recoupes. But
okay.
And my editor,
Yes.
the same editor who suggested a few years earlier that I write a book called How to Write a Sentence, and who just a couple of months ago has made a suggestion that I write a book, which I'm now writing, called Free Speech in America. So this is all the same editor. So one might say, she's an editor at HarperCollins. Her name is Julia Chaffetz. Okay. So one might say that Julia Chaffetz is the only begetter of Stanley Fish's work, because she keeps coming up, A, with suggestions, and B, with advances. Okay. so who can resist that? But I've had a lifetime interest in the in argument, because I was in graduate school introduced to the ancient classical, medieval, Renaissance, 18th to 19th century tradition of rhetoric with a capital R. All of those sometimes massive tomes put out by Cicero and Quintilian and their successors, in which the storehouse of arguments and the manner of argument and the style of argument and the manner of presentation are studied and anatomized in ways that have not been improved on. And when they did that, and starting with Aristotle's rhetoric, when they did that, they knew that rhetoric, the art of persuasion, was from the very beginning for a great many people a suspect project, and was opposed to unadorned reason, which should be the best conveyor of argument. In other words, at the beginning of the third book of his rhetoric, when Aristotle is introducing the subject of style, figures of speech, and the rest of that, he apologizes for having to instruct his readers in so low a subject. And he says, I wish it were the case that the presentation of the facts alone would always prove successful. But in fact, other matters make a great difference, and now I'm quoting, owing to the defects of our hearers. Owing to the defects of our hearers, meaning what Francis Bacon spoke of in his great essays on education and epistemology, meaning those tendencies in the human consciousness to be swayed by artificially pumped up arguments or to be easily flattered by speakers who were trying to move them in a certain direction. And so it's because of that human tendency, which in a theological tradition would be called original sin. It's because of that human tendency that good people, said Aristotle, have to equip themselves with the arts of rhetorical persuasion so that they can provide a counterweight to the bad people who are skilled in the arts of rhetorical persuasion. So I've been studying and writing about this tradition in various ways, teaching courses in it forever and ever and ever. Now, one of the things that is true of the rhetorical tradition The rhetorical tradition does not begin by assuming that the truth is known and can be simply presented and therefore protected. In fact, the rhetorical tradition, and this is an oversimplification, of course, but the rhetorical tradition begins by assuming that the truth has yet to be discovered, and that the current state in which the truth is presented is the product of historical investigation, and there's always and debate, and there's always the possibility that a new round of historical investigation and debate will upset the truths that now seem to carry the day and end in the discovery of new ones. And then, of course, the project doesn't end then. You keep on going and going and going. So rather than opposing rhetoric and acts of persuasion to the truth, in this tradition, truths emerge in the context of the rhetorical process. So the mistake is to think that you could get rid of all those aspects of language that you might list under categories like persuasive, instrumental, politically inflected, and the rest of that. And when you did that, then you'd have an instrument of language which was truly designed to register the truth. And in fact, you could then require people to use that language and no other. And if they obeyed the requirement, they could not speak anything but truth. Now, this is so absurd, so bizarre. It's like saying, well, there's a shortcut way to get back to Eden. Just purify our language. And that's the business that Habermas is in. Because Habermas says, look...
He's too utopian, you think?
Well, see, in this respect, he's just flat out dumb. He says, let's, well, he calls something called the universal speech situation, or in which he says, what you have to do first is divest yourself of all of the linguistic resources that tend to be instrumental, that is, tend to be implements of the realization of your particular partisan views. Get rid of all of that. Speak not for yourself or as yourself in a particular historical moment, but speak in cooperation with others who are just seeking the universal truth. And if you can just do that, that is, have that as your project, you'll be on your way. Well, if you could be on your way to that project, you'd already be there. Okay. So that doesn't work at all. So the whole idea of a universal, that's what Habermas says specifically. We want a situation in which people, when they're in dialogue with one another, only use the better arguments, by which he means arguments that are not tied to some specific partisan purpose or point of view. Okay. Then the question is, well, how do you know which ones are those? And once you realize that the answer to that is going to be the occasion of a dispute, you'll say, well, these are the better arguments. And somebody over here on the other side of the room will say, no, these are the better arguments. So that the better argument project, which is designed to bypass dispute, immediately concludes in the new opening of dispute. So it's never going to work. It's never going to work. And this is Habermas's project is one of the more recent instantiations of a very old project, the one that I named a few moments ago. The idea that if we purify our language use, we'll purify our thoughts, we'll purify our persons, we'll purify our politics. If only it were that. He's another person who believed this in perhaps the worst essay ever written by a major political figure, or rather literary figure, is Orwell's Politics and the English Language. A totally bizarre and mindless, also racist and elitist essay.
George Orwell fans, don't write to me, write to Stanley.
In which he says, look, the trouble with the English language, which is now beginning to infect English politics, is that there are too many foreign words. We got words from these French and Italian and Russian people. Who the hell are they? And what we need is a language, he said, made up of only Anglo-Saxon words, and also words that do not refer to abstract qualities, but refer only to things. That's the message of that very celebrated essay. People just invoke that essay and fall down before it in worship, and I can't believe that they have in fact read it, because it is so bad. The answer to all of these projects, whether it's Habermas, whether it's George Orwell, whether it's Rudolf Carnap, who was a logical positivist of the early 20th century.
What about Chomsky and his linguistics?
No, he doesn't present any particular utopian hopes for his linguistic project. These people are all presenting utopian hopes, saying again, if we purify our language in certain directions, everything else will be better. And the idea is, again, that we can achieve a transformation in our own persons, and therefore in the life we communally live by altering our language habits. Now, the answer to all of this was given by Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels. In the third book of Gulliver's Travels, Swift comes upon the island, I think it is, of Legado, in which the inhabitants have become very impressed by the capacities of language to deceive and distort and to be the conveyor of lies. So they decide that the only way to remedy this unhappy situation is to get rid of words. And so what do? But then therefore, how do they communicate? Well, the answer, Swift tells us, is that citizens of Legado carried, when they went out of their houses, carried huge backpacks of things. And when two of them met and wanted to have a conversation, he says, they would sit by the roadside, open up their respective backpacks, and then show things. And that, in fact, as silly as it is, because that will only work as long as you're just showing a thing. But suppose you want to say to your fellow backpacker that the thing that I just showed you is better than the thing that you just showed me. Once that happens, showing won't do the job, and you're right back in the kind of discursive persuasiveness that everyone in this tradition is suspicious of. And so, as far as I'm concerned, Swift exploded this project from the very beginning, but it has a perennial appeal. The idea that, our language has gotten so bad it's corrupt and foul and distorting, and therefore we're corrupt and foul and distorting, and therefore our politics are corrupt and foul and distorting. It's also the idea behind the French Academy, which wants to purify its language, keep it in a steady state. All of this is never going to work because of the way in which human beings are and will continue to be. Computer language is another example. Transparency, of which I've already spoken, is another example. All this stuff, to use a word that I've already overused, is absolutely silly.
Well, Stanley, I'm so glad as I turn around here, I look and I see Shakespeare's sonnets on the bookshelf behind me. And you mentioned Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, who I became aware of when I was an English major at Fordham University. I switched my major from business to English. I'm very glad I made that decision, although I'm still trying to make some money. So I don't know, I think business knowledge is important as well. But I did take a class at Fordham in neoclassical literature, where I learned about Swift, and I also learned about John Milton, who you are a great devotee of. Sure. So in the time that's remaining, I do want to I want to turn to literature itself and think about some of the works that have inspired you over the years that got you into literature. We're going to be interviewing Mr. Harold Bloom in 2 weeks. We're going up to New Haven, and he wrote that wonderful book, How to Read and Why. So you were the two titans of literary theory and culture. Talk a little bit about your literary life and your beginnings, and in terms of the books that inspired you, Milton and before Milton. And
well, inspire is not a verb with which I feel comfortable. a humanistic scholar, in addition to being a legal scholar. And by that I mean I enter into conversations with other scholars about a set of works that has been the object of attention and analysis for a long time. It's a profession. I believe very strongly in professions and in the professional task. So when I came into the business of being a professor of literature, it wasn't in my case because I had a great love of literature. It's not that I don't enjoy literature. In fact, I do. But that wasn't the reason. The reason was that I was interested, reason is and was, that I was interested in the kinds of literary problems presented by complicated texts, and also, again, in the arguments developed for dealing with, or at least attempting to deal with, these problems. To give you a very simple example, ever since 1695, which is approximately 22 years after Paradise Lost was written, there's been a debate as to whether or not Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost. Now, that's 1695. This is 2018. Guess what? The debate is still going in the same terms. And it's recently been studied in a very important 2-volume work, which is up here somewhere. I guess I don't see it, but that's all right. I might have brought it back to my apartment.
Okay.
Studying the history of Milton criticism, and which is in part a history of the attempts to answer that question. And I'm fascinated by the way those arguments go, and also by the fact, for which there seems to be great evidence, that the argument is interminable, that it's never going to be concluded. And if it does seem to be concluded for a while, something will get it going once again. So I like making arguments. I also like introducing students and actually friends and relatives to the power of literary work. By that power of literary work, I don't mean necessarily the power of literary work to inspire persons to actions, although that may sometimes happen. Never happened to me, but it happened to others.
Okay.
I mean the power of literary work in the sense that when you read something, you are absolutely knocked out by it.
Yes.
Not knocked out by the display of virtuosity by someone who is using the same language that you also speak and write, but somehow does with that language things that you couldn't imagine doing yourself, right? You see that? So, for example, George Herbert, one of the great poets in the English language, wrote a poem called Redemption. It's a poem about, it's an allegory of a kind about a man who has a lease on a piece of land, but doesn't like the terms of the lease and would like to see the terms rewritten, and so goes in search of his landlord to see if he could get a better deal. Now, it turns out that the land that he has a lease on is his own body, and that the landlord is God, or in the case of Herbert's poem, Christ. So he's looking for a new deal, not knowing that he already has one, simply by the fact that Christ died for his sins and has saved him, if only he, that is the speaker of the poem, will accept that salvation. So the poem, which is only 14 lines long, is about the search by the leaseholder for his landlord so he can begin a renegotiation. Again, not knowing that the lease has been entirely rewritten by the landlord in ways that he can barely fathom. So he searches for this landlord, goes to heaven, it's not there. He's told that he's, in fact, back on earth. He searches on earth in the usual places that he would think to find him, in great palaces or other places where the so-called finer people meet. And then he's walking on the street and peers into an alley, and he sees the landlord amidst a group of thieves who are in the process of stabbing and killing him. And this is the last the last line of the poem. Your suit is this is the Christ as he's dying says, your suit is granted, he said, and died. I mean, the power of that line, which I've inadequately conveyed by my paraphrase of the poem, is extraordinary. It's just absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that Herbert did this in that poem and in many, many other poems, and it is something that I'm always trying to impress upon my students, and to get them to see the ways in which language in the hands of some can lead to the production of what we might even call verbal monuments. Now, no one, I don't expect my students to be able themselves to produce verbal monuments, nor do I expect myself to do so. But I think that the act of learning how to appreciate and analyzing that effect is an interesting one. When I say that, when I use the word interesting, it's with a deliberate modesty, let's say, because I don't want to claim that much for the skills that I am able, I hope, to impart to my students. That is, I teach people how to read the poetry of Herbert or Milton or Donne or Andrew Marvell or Wallace Stevens. If I teach people how to do this, what I will have enabled them to do is enter the conversation that I have been privileged to enter as an academic professional, and for which, lo and behold, I'm actually paid.
Yes.
This is
a miracle.
This is extraordinary. But I don't want to make any more claims. So I tell, if I were to speak to my students in these terms, which I usually do not in my classes, I would say, look, what I can do is teach you how to enter this world of literary analysis and appreciation and participate in it. What I can't promise is that having done so, you will become a better person, or you will go out and vote in the right way, or you will be nicer to your mother, or anything like that. It's just that I have become educated in this skill, and I'm ready and, in fact, very pleased to pass it on to you. And that's it. Now, what then happens in the lives of the persons to whom I'm able to pass on this skill is up to them, and I have no idea what they're going to do with it. Sometimes you find out when students come back and tell you things, but more times than not, they exit the classroom door at the end of the semester, and you never hear from them again. And that's the way the teaching life is. Generation of students with whom you had an intense and bonding relationship for 14 and 15 weeks, and then they step into the void.
Is there something sad about that?
There is something a little bit sad about that. Okay. But on the other hand, if you have the correct limited aspirations, the sadness will be mitigated. By that I mean this. If what you want to do and think it your responsibility to do is bring the students to a mastery of the subject matter and the analytical procedures that you are teaching, that's something you can actually do by planning a good course, collecting the appropriate materials, structuring the presentation of those materials. You can actually do that. Now, if you wanted to do something more, like produce students who will then go out and save the world, you're going to be perpetually disappointed.
Thank you for that. Claudia gave us the 4-minute sign. As we start to wrap up, just to turn back to literature, and if I could open my backpack here and share with you some of my favorite writers: John Updike, Philip Roth. I'm reading Moby Dick now for the first time. Harold Bloom is actually sending me back to Shakespeare. Could you just throw out a couple of favorite writers?
Well, you've named, I'm a big Updike fan. And in fact, the first sentence analyzed in my book, How to Write a Sentence, that is the first lengthy analysis in that book is of an Updike sentence, the sentence that he wrote in an essay called Hub Fans Bid the Kid Adieu, when he was present on that day, I think it was in 1960, when Ted Williams appeared in his last game for the Red Sox and hit a home run in his last time at bat.
Cub fans, you said?
No, Hub fans. Boston Hub.
Boston Hub.
Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu. I think that's the title. But anyway, it's a lyrical essay often thought to be the best piece of sports journalism ever written.
Wow.
And in it is this sentence talking about the home run. The ball was in the books while it was still in the sky. And then, so that's a great sentence.
Beautiful.
So I like. There's also, you mentioned Roth.
Yes.
The first sentence of Goodbye Columbus. The first time I met Brenda, she asked me to hold her glasses. Oh,
Man.
you know where that relationship is going to go. But the poets to whom I return again and again are the ones that I've already mentioned: George Herbert, John Milton, Andrew Marvell, Ben Jonson, who is less studied and valued than the others today, but is absolutely great. I'm also a great fan of Wallace Stevens, in the American canon. But I don't. I'm somewhat Catholic in my literary taste. I'm just looking for texts which display that exuberant and almost mystical virtuosity that I spoke of before.
Wonderful. Are you friendly with Harold Bloom?
I've met Harold on a couple of occasions.
Yes.
But I'm not. I can't say that I'm a friend of his, although I certainly have warm and friendly feelings toward him.
Well, thank you so much. As we wrap up, there's so much more I wanted to say. I feel like this dialogue could go on, and I hope that, Stanley, you'll come back again, and you could be a recurring guest on our show, and we'd like this to go out to more people in the world, to keep alive literary culture, literary life, for various reasons. Some say pleasure and happiness, and Stanley also is a great theorist of the argument and the art of the argument, and we're going to continue to check in with you to see how your work is going, and we really appreciate this great honor to meet you, Stanley Fish.
It was a great pleasure, and I will, if you ask me, come back again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.